here. Let's give them the greatest big welcome in the world famous Purple Helmets on Protest Promenade.
For 27 years, the Purple Helmets have been entertaining crowds in the Isle of Man. This year is going to be their final year performing together. In this part one of a two-part programme, Jim Davidson and Derry Kissack from the Purple Helmets share with me their memories. How did the Helmets get started?
Well, it's quite well documented, Simon, that at the time I was the chairman of the Southern Motorcycle Club and we didn't have much money. But we'd always helped Steve Colley as a young rider to better his career, and he needed to travel away quite a bit to pursue that. And we had sponsored him to a few quid over the years. And I had an idea that to make some money for the club, we needed to do some kind of a show and possibly charge a bit of money at the gate or whatever. So we thought we'd do a pilot show and get Steve Colley if he was willing. And of course he was, always a gentleman. Steve offered his services, but he said that he could really do with a backup act to give his wrists a rest, give his arms a rest from his vigorous stunting performance. So I had a word with some of the lads who were the Sheep Skulls at the time, which is the enduro arm of what is now the Purple Helmets. The Sheep Skulls had been riding for quite a few years in the British Enduro Championships, and 8 of them thought they would put a bit of a show together just to back up Steve Colley for one night, actually, Simon. That's all it was for.
And this was 1995, wasn't it?
As far back as that, 95. And they decided they'd do a show. Well, some of them said, well, we've never actually done a show. We're the Sheep Skull Enduro riders. And they had the big coats at the time. And they said, well, what would we call ourselves? And I think somebody said, well, we'd be a bit like the White Helmets, the famous Royal Signals team, Army team. And somebody else laughed and they said, be a bit more like the Purple Helmets. And he did a hand gesture at the same moment. And someone else intervened and said, well, why not call ourselves world famous? Simply because nobody had ever heard of us. Tongue-in-cheek, as ever, dark glasses for anonymity. And that's how it was, tongue-in-cheek. Nobody had heard of us, so we were world famous. That's how it came about.
It's amazing, really, because I mean, some of the guys, obviously we'll talk about later, but very, very good motorcyclists, off-road, riders,
yeah.
And I mean, I don't suppose they were renowned for sort of performance or things like that, were they?
Well, one or two. I would go as far as to say genius. There is some genius in some of them. They think outside the box. More in the pub than outside the box, really. But some of the funny things that come out when we do get together, it's legendary to this day that they've got to be good riders. I always compared it in my commentary to Les Dawson playing the piano badly. You've got to be very good to be very bad. And this is how it came about. There were no slouches. The lads had to be able to perform with a touch of genius, and of course they needed to like beer. That was one of the vital things. They had to like a drink or two, socially, of course.
Yeah.
But
not during the performances, like some would think.
Well, occasionally, if they still had a bit in the bottom of the glass, maybe. But
what about the bikes themselves? I mean, they're renowned for the bulletproof, really, and they had to be the Honda C90s. Was that always the choice, or did they do it on proper motocross bikes?
There is a story to that as well, because some years before, when they did attend the British Enduro Championships, there was a journalist called Mike Rapley, and he's still around. If you're listening to this, Mike, hello, because he was partly responsible for this. He thought that the Manx lads were lowering the tone of the enduro by putting these sheep skulls on the front mudguards of their bikes. They were the sheep skull enduro riders with bleached out bone skulls off the mountains of the Isle of Man.
And they were serious about objecting to...
And he was quite serious, quite stuffy about it, really. And he said that the Manx lads were lowering the tone. Well, one or two of them thought, well, in typical Manx fashion, he thought, well, we'll show 'em what lowering the tone is all about. We'll get some big army coats and we'll get some old Honda 90s and see what you think of that. And really, I suppose, he's partly responsible for the formation of the Purple Helmets.
Really?
And Jimmy can probably tell you more about the Hondas than me. He's still got his original bike, Jim, haven't you?
I have, yeah. I bought mine. Mine was originally a pizza delivery bike when I bought mine, 1996. And it had a rack on the back for the pizzas, which I had to remove. And it's a bit like Trigger's Broom, really. I mean, I've still got the same logbook, same motor, same chassis. I mean, it's had a few, incarnations in between, but it's still the same bike. But all the bikes were based on Honda 90s. You weren't allowed to have anything but a Honda 90. That was the rules.
Not even a 70?
You could have a 70.
Yes.
Yeah, some of the 70s were fairly quick, but nothing bigger than 90cc, so that when we were racing through the tracks and things, everybody was on equal bikes.
Same colour, Jim. They're still painted black.
Matte black.
Everything had to be painted matte black, including the crash helmets. And
although there was one year, wasn't there, where we were down at we used to do a lot of work down at Wilson and Collins factory down in Balfane, a lot of preparations, and one of the guys one night hadn't turned up for one of the work parties that we used to do down there, so one of the lads had the gun with the red lead in it, so they decided that as this other lad hadn't turned up, we were going to respray his bike. So we resprayed the bike completely, everything, tyres, chain, seat, the lot, even the headlights. And
red oxide.
It was red oxide, the whole bike was red oxide.
Yeah, but I mean, what was the first occasion with Steve Colley? I mean, what sort of stunts were performed on that one?
Well, they were...
Do you remember the first sort of ones they did?
We remember it very well. And I think, just to cap that, when it was on, we had Roy Moore there that night, a great friend of ours, Roy, who was commentating, because he is still an authority, actually, on Steve Colley. He knew everything he'd done. And we invited Roy to come along to commentate. Well, when he saw the Purple Helmets for the first time, he was almost speechless because he'd never seen anything like it. And the impact, I have to say this time, and even after all these years, the first time you see the big coats appear with the noise of the little Hondas, the impact of it is in your brain forever. And Roy couldn't stop. He was actually looking at it and thinking, well, what am I going to say about this? And we hadn't primed him in any way. He didn't know what to expect. And when one or two crashed, as they do, he said, oh dear me, they've had a crash, you see. So I was standing near him and I said, well, they're actually supposed to crash, Roy. So then he got the gist of it, and it turned out to be a fantastic little performance. But it was up the back of the testing station at Tremode, and rather than an amphitheatre, the ground sloped away from the tarmac. It sloped downhill, so the further back you got, you couldn't see a thing, and the ones at the front could just peep over the footpath to see the wheels. Well, it was quite amazing, and Steve Colley actually rode a couple of the bikes over the scrap cars we had there for him, and he thought it had a bit of mileage in it, and he was riding over my wagon at the time, my Ford wagon. Steve was riding over the top of it, but he didn't ride over it on the Hondas, I have to say. He didn't chance that. But that impact, I don't know how to put it to you, really. The impact when you see those coats for the first time, and these sombre-looking guys with the dark glasses, and they're not supposed to smile because it's tongue-in-cheek, obviously. Look at us, we're world famous. Well, I have to say that's gone by the board a bit lately. People do tend to laugh. And
But how did it develop from then? I mean, how did it gather momentum? Obviously,
I think
people were talking about it, and people who had seen it.
Yeah, the big step forward really would be in '96, the year after. We sort of realised there's a lot of mileage in this. It's not just for one night. And the crowd was still talking about it the following year. So we decided we'd have to get a better venue. And I remember I rang Mervyn Wynne, it was, at the corporation, and I said, what about hire us the Bowl, King George V Park, for the night? He said, oh, well, you can, he said, but it's £12.50, you know. And I said, I didn't realise that. Oh, yes, he said that the groundsman has to come and lock up after, and we have to pay him time and a half to come and lock the gate. I said, oh, right, OK then, well, I'll bear that in mind, Mervyn. So that seems quite incredible now, that you could hire King George Park, the Bowl, for £12.50, but it seemed better to me that maybe if we tried Onken Stadium. So we went up there, and I think Steve Collins came with me, and we went up and had a meeting with the commissioners. Well, some of them had seen the Purple Helmets and some of them hadn't. So it was quite a job to explain to them why we wanted the stadium. And at the time, nobody did hire the stadium. It was just an empty place that had go-karts. Well, we eventually did a deal, and I think we had to pay as much as £18, which was quite a lot of money at the time. Well, no, it wasn't actually. I think they thought we were taking the mickey, because they said, well, how much would you be prepared to pay for the stadium? I said, well, I'm not here on my own, on behalf of me. I said, I'm here on behalf of the Southern Motorcycle Club, a non-profit making organisation. And we have been quoted £12.50 by Douglas Corporation, bear that in mind. And they all looked at one another and they said, well, could you manage a bit more? And I said, well, we might go to 18. And they all agreed. And we came out of there laughing our heads off, to be honest, because it was for nothing. It really was, but it was a gamble. We had to get police, we had to get gate people, we had to get tickets printed. It was a big, big step forward, believe me, to go into a stadium likely to hold thousands, as against a poor amphitheatre that cost nothing, but nobody could see.
The other thing as well was that when we looked at the stadium, we realised that it was a big place to do stunts. So we had to then come up with new ideas about, what we could do to fill in the time allotted, because we had Steve Colley there as well that year, didn't we?
He was brilliant. He jumped off the bus
as a backup.
He was our backup that year. Yeah, it all changed around. So
no offence, Steve.
Yeah, no offence, Steve. No, it was a great sort of double act, really, and we had to come up with all sorts of new stunts, because we knew that what the guys had done the previous year wasn't going to cut it up at Onken Stadium. So that's when we had to start thinking of props and making various things and contraptions and things like that. So that's how it all started to. It started to grow from there the first year, and then it went from there, didn't it?
Yeah. What was it like, Jim? For them first times in front of the crowd, just being sort of normal motorbike fellas.
Awesome, I would say.
It was. To be honest, I felt really nervous. I'd never performed in front of a crowd before. And, I think the first year we had 3,000 or 4,000 people there in the crowd. And to be honest, you get kind of nervous. You're almost like you're on stage. You're like, you're performing. And it was a bit nerve-wracking. But at the end of the day, the boys all had a few beers and we relaxed ourselves. And we just went out there and just did. We had a set list of what we were going to do. And it just went to plan. And again, for the following year, we thought, well, we can do something else better next year. And so that's how it snowballed.
Right.
It grew phenomenally. One year, I think it was packed out on the bank track that they used for the cycling years ago. That was packed. Every seat, there was standing room only, and it grew to be quite a legend. Those Onken shows were amazing. We had French guys, a guy called Jorian Pomerev. I remember he was there. And he wasn't all that good, really, but when he fell off, I remember shouting, Châteauneuf du Pape, everyone! And the crowd stood up and cheered. I don't know why, but they did anyway. But that was a bit of the history of Onken Stadium. And when we eventually started to get the white helmets, who I brought over, I was instrumental in bringing the white helmets over 5 times.
The proper.
The real thing, because it had always been my ambition to ride with them.
Had they heard of you?
Oh, well, amazingly, yes. And when I contacted them the first time, they readily agreed to come because they were in awe of us. believe it or not. I know that sounds a bit naff, but they were, and we made great friends amongst them, Jimmy, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
We keep in touch with a lot of them.
Yeah.
And what they did really was very, very good, if you look at some of the stuff they did. But a lot of people didn't realise just how good they were, because I remember a little lad saying to me one night on the promenade, he said, don't think much of the white helmets. He said, they're not very funny, are they? And I said, well, they're not meant to be funny. Well, we were meant to be funny, but I don't know if we were or not.
But the tricks, the stunts that you do, though, it's not just anybody that can do them.
Oh, absolutely.
There are good riders in them purple helmets to do them stunts, because a lot of the bikes are modified especially for some stunts, aren't they?
Yeah, some of the stunts really are very dangerous. In fact, we've had injuries, broken bones, and
you know, when you do your commentary, Derry, you talk about speeds approaching 100 mile an hour.
I
but
never told a lie, Simon.
Rumour has it that one of the bikes had a bit of a modification by one of the wonderful late riders, was it?
It was our good friend, the late Steve Young. He had a nitrous oxide kit on his Honda 90. There's actually a picture of us going over the mountain road somewhere, and we had actually been overtaken by 600 Hondas and things. The next thing, Steve Young went past everybody on this Honda 90.
It was very short-lived, though, wasn't it?
Short-lived. It lasted something like 8 or 10 seconds, the nitrous, and then he was back to normal. Yeah. But he was a great guy, Jimmy, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. And
But of course, the many years you've been doing it, it's had its ups and it's had its downs, Derry, and you were involved in one of the downs.
Yeah, indeed. There's been accidents, and you know, I was up on the mountain road one time, and I was taken very roughly from behind by a German, and I shouldn't be laughing about it actually, because I got very badly smashed up in the femur and collarbone, ribs, the whole thing. And it was a police and ambulance job, and well, the upshot of it was I had a broken leg for nearly 10 years, but that's all in the past. And sadly, the saddest part of it, I suppose, is when we lose someone. And the first person actually to die was Steve Hislop, God bless him. He rode with us in the early days, and big friend of Jimmy's. Steve was a very, very good rider. And in fact, I've still got his coat at home.
Got a good story about Steve, actually. We were there was one TT that we were going to see the Van Morrison concert at the Villa. And of course, everybody at the time was going into the central pub at the bottom of Broadway for a beer before they went into the concert, you see. So there was us lot there. There was about, again, 18 or 20 of us all walk into the pub. And the first man to the bar, it was probably Steve Collins or somebody like that, straight to the bar and orders 20 pints of bitter. And Steve's at the back shouting, lager for me, lager for me. Didn't hear him. Carried on. Anyway, all these pints of bitter come out to the boys. And Steve gets this pint of bitter and looks at it. And he said, but I wanted lager. And he said, oh, the boy said, just drink it. So he drank it and he said, aye, it's not as bad as you think.
I said, ale is not as bad as you think. And in fact, I think it was Jimmy printed it on one of the T-shirts.
I did, aye.
And it's a picture of Ochel's Ale, and Steve Hislop, and he says, aye, ale, it's not as bad as you think. Well, we thought the world of Hizzy and when he was gone, but a few of the lads have died over the years, and
Chunk as well.
Chunk and Michael Alty was a great favourite with the crowd. 6'4" and shock of blonde hair on him, and a wonderful rider. I think he was British Enduro champion at one stage, the juniors. But when Mikey turned up, the party started. I think Jimmy will agree with me.
Exactly, did, yeah.
He was fantastic people.
And he was larger than life, wasn't he, Michael?
Larger than life.
Yeah.
But it's great that their memory live on, the videos and things that are still off them, yeah. And of course, the shock for some people when you first time you introduce a new act with the sidecar with your man playing the piano, and everyone thinks, oh, this is quite novel, and then when it gets around to them, there's just this big bare ass sticking out.
He likes to think of it as the number one plate.
Yeah. He says he's very proud, as Finney, the piano rider.
he's certainly a character.
He's great, isn't he?
But you mentioned Steve Hislop there, the late and great Steve Hislop. But I mean, you've had people like Bruce Anstey and Charlie Bowman in as guests, champing at the bit to get on them.
Well, Bruce is a great friend of ours. He would ride on the Pyramid today and win the race tomorrow. I think some of the riders are a bit more wary of us, and certainly wouldn't want to risk an injury before the race day. But it never seemed to bother Bruce, did it, Jim?
No.
He would get up there on the Pyramid. He's a great guy, Bruce Anstey.
Grinning from ear to ear, wasn't he, at the top of the Pyramid? Loved it.
It's just one of them guys that everyone loves.
We've got a great history with it all. I remember one time Mr. Yoshi, the boss of Honda, he was the big boss. And one night in Onken Stadium, I persuaded him to go in a wheelie bin in the bin race. Well, Bob Macmillan was there, boss of Honda UK, an old friend of ours, and he said to me, "Of course, you are insured to have Yoshi in the bin." Oh, yes. Let's go. Well, of all the bins to put him in, he was being towed by Pac Brigazzi. And Pac's bike has the smoke machine, where it's clouds of diesel-smelling smoke. Well, the passenger in the bin gets black face and soaked in water from the puddles and whatever. And when Yoshi had finished his race, he came in, and when he smiled, his teeth were snow white, and all you could see was the whites of his eyes and his teeth. He was as black as a rook, and that was the big boss of Honda. We've had a great association with Honda over the years.
Yeah, well, you're using their bikes.
After all, yes, they're the most famous little motorbike in the world.
And now they're fetching huge amounts of money, the Honda 90. You can't buy one.
You won't
unless
get one
you're
for
going to
less
part
than
with
£2,000.
Really?
£2,000 to buy one nowadays on the likes of the auction sites, and you just can't get them.
But did the bikes? I mean, one of the low points, I suppose, as well was all the bikes where they were stored with all your gear. There was a fire one year, if I remember.
There was a big fire. Well, luckily, all the stunt guys and the main men have their own bikes at home. And it was all the props, like the rollover bike and the long bike and the sidecar and the wheelie bins. They all went up in a big fire at Wilson and Collins.
It caused thousands of pounds of improvements, though, didn't it?
It was rumoured at the time that the fire was the best thing that ever happened. But there was hours and hours of work in some of these things, and the thought of them at the time, I think we'd developed a high bike, a long bike, a rollover bike. Well, the high bike wasn't very successful, was it, Jimmy?
No.
Kept bringing the phone wires down as we went through. And
well, what about the rollover bike? Did it take much, design?
Development.
Who was the test pilot?
Well, the builder, Steve Collins, of course, had the Wilson and Collins factory down there, and he built the first rollover bike, and they just bent these tubes over, and then he thought, right, we're going to have to attach these to the bike. So they worked out a circumference of this particular.
A bit of science went and maths.
Oh, yes. It must have taken about. The matchbox was only fairly small, wasn't it?
It was measured out in cubits. I think it was that far back.
But we've still got it. It doesn't. It over the years it got bent out of shape because the force to actually get the thing to roll over, it started to bend the steel, and the guy that does the rollover did what we decided was a world record one year. He did 4 rolls.
It's absolutely amazing. He's the best at it, and there's no doubt about that. Our own little stunt man, Gary Flowers, he's absolutely incredible on the rollover bike. And in Onken Stadium one night, he did 4 rollovers, which to do that, it had to be tramping on to start with. It had to be going at a fair old lick. And I remember it getting up to 3, and I said 3.5, and it was nearly over. And eventually it just went the last bit, and such a cheer from the crowd.
Toppled over, didn't it?
Yeah. Well,
Derry Kissack and Jim Davidson from the Purple Helmets giving their memories of the Purple Helmets, with this year going to be their final year performing together. Join us next Tuesday for part 2, where Derry and Jim talk about troubles with the police in the Czech Republic, and also a funny story when they met up with Prince William here on the Isle of Man.